Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. If this is your first time tuning in to the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, as we are continuing our positional breakdown. We have gone through the offensive line. We have gone through the defensive backs. We have gone through the wide receivers, the tight ends, the running backs. Today, we are going back to the trenches, talking about the defensive line and the edge group. And you know, with this new regime that is in town with Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh, they are going to want to prioritize the trenches. And I know as it relates to pick 5, edge and defensive line is not a position that has been talked about much with the Chargers, because obviously all focus is going to be on that, depending on what the Chargers are going to do, where they're going to prioritize positions. But when we're going to go through this, I think there's going to be a new sense of, I don't want to necessarily say urgency, but possibly urgency, given who's on the roster, how much spending money the Chargers can possibly bring in, spend to bring in an outside free agent, maybe just as a stopgap option. How are they going to build to pair with Tuli Tuipulotu? What is this edge room even going to look like by the time that we get to the 2024 regular season? So a lot of question marks. Excited to dive into this and break everything down. But of course, before we do that, Dan Wolkenstein, sir, how are you? It's rainy in California, but how's your day going?
It's going great. I actually took some work to a coffee shop only to have the internet go out as soon as I got there. So that was like, all right, cool. This is how my morning's going. But otherwise, got that back up and running. So things were great. So I got my leftover coffee here in hand. It's good, man. This is a fun episode, an important episode. And to your point, and we'll talk about this more, you go look at the defenses of Jesse Minter and the mentality of Jim Harbaugh through the years and how important the defensive line success is. Not necessarily star-studded, but the defensive line by committee, I sort of talk about. This is a very big group and kind of sets the tone for a lot of what Jesse Minter's defense does, and probably what a lot of defenses do, but the way that they do it is a little different. So this is a fun one, and you pair that with what the Chargers currently have on the roster and some of the volatility and the variables that the Chargers have at the positions, to who they're going to keep and let go from a salary cap perspective, from a performance perspective, from a draft capital perspective. Fascinating stuff, so pumped to get into this one. Jake, this is probably one of your favorites because this is combining, obviously, draft stuff with free agent stuff, with performance and the big uglies, if you will, and the trenches. I'm excited for this one, and there's a lot to get to, so let's get started. Okay, so today, just for formatting purposes, we're going to go through the edge and the interior defensive line guys currently on the roster. Then we'll go through some guys who are free agents at both positions that the Chargers could possibly target, followed by Jake's favorite time, all things NFL draft prospects for both positions, where they can target, some guys to maybe look out for, and possible dream scenarios. All of that coming up on this episode. Super exciting one. But Jake, before we start, I think we got to kind of take a step backwards, look at what this team looked like and the guys currently on the roster and the state of this squad. So without further ado, Jake, let's get into it. There's so many ways to start this, honestly. And you look at the edge position, and there's obviously some positions here that you can kind of combine a little bit. So, for example, like a Morgan Fox, I would say he's kind of a tweener, kind of like a Kyle Van Noy 2 years ago. That's kind of a tweener type. For the Chargers, though, the defensive line as a whole is so fascinating to me because there are so many doors that this Chargers team can walk through, and that all hinges on like one position that they do, like one transaction that they make can change kind of the landscape of this entire group. If they keep Khalil Mack, that impacts so many pieces. If they trade Khalil Mack, what comp are they getting for it? If they trade or release Mack and Bosa, what do they get for it? To start with the edge group, though, like this is the larger discussion. And this is why a lot of people nationally, locally talk about the decision, the big decision, the cap hell, quote unquote, that the Chargers team is in. 2 of the 4 biggest reasons for it are on the defensive end side of it. The wide receiver side, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, who talks about that. Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Khalil Mack, and Joey Bosa are the 4 highest cap hits on this Chargers team. And I circled it here for those watching on YouTube. $77 million. $77 million, 30% of the cap hit for 2024 is slated to go to Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa. Again, we talked about this on a previous episode. Those two numbers, $38 million cap hit for Khalil Mack, $36 million cap hit for Joey Bosa, top 2 in the entire NFL. For reference, Jake and friends, the average edge position makes $12 million. Both of these guys are triple that. Now, before we get to like who stays, who goes, what do they do, ask yourself, if there was one of those guys, who do you think deserves that money? Or let me take a step back. Before he deserves money, who do you think the Chargers would want to keep, all things considered? We're talking age, we're talking trade value, we're talking production, fit with the scheme, you name it. Which of those two, before we get to Thule and Chris Rumpf, of the top 2 names, which do you think the Chargers want to actually keep on the roster?
I mean, scheme fit, I think it fits Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack very well for what Jesse Minter is going to do. So I think that's a wash. You take age, obviously, Joey Bosa is 5 years younger than Khalil Mack, I believe. So youth definitely plays into play there. Joey Bosa is still under 30. Khalil Mack, though, this is where the big hammer swings in his favor is the production and the health aspects, because Khalil Mack, 30 plus years old now, going in would be 33, and he has one of his best years that he's ever had in the NFL in terms of production last year. And this is without Joey Bosa. This is pairing him alongside the Tuli Tuipulotu. And for what he did throughout the season, even from a macro sense of, not impacting the Chargers defense that much, but if you just put it in a nutshell for him, he was fantastic for what he was able to do. And based off of previous years, the last 2, as it relates to Joey Bosa, it's difficult to, again, take that type of a cap hit and trust that things are going to be different as it relates to his health. I'm not knocking anything about Joey Bosa's talent, because as it relates to setting the edge against the run, he's one of the best the Chargers have. He's definitely better with this team than this team is without him. But in the same category, type of question as Mike Williams, can you trust that? And over the last 2 years, unfortunately, it just hasn't panned out that way. And when you have to make tough financial decisions like this is one of the ones that probably makes the most sense, as far as whether it's just an outright release or you're able to find a trade partner for Joey Bosa, regardless of what that compensation is going to look like. That would probably be the way to go, even though Khalil Mack probably has the best trade value out of the two, given the production that he's put up over the last 2 years.
I'm so torn on what to do with this position as a whole. And again, the guys who are on this current team that are on the slate roster 2024, the only 4 are Mack and Bosa, Thule, and Chris Rumpf. That's it. So if you get rid of one, they're going to have to replace him with someone I don't think you're going to get someone at the same value or same production as Khalil freaking Mack, obviously. But I go back to like the edge by committee. I'm torn because as much as, you hear Joe Ortiz talk about like what they're still looking for championships and wanting to win this coming season. They're after the Corey Linsley restructure. They're about 45-ish million.
I thought it was down to 35.
I think it's 45 effectively when you take into account the draft picks they also have to sign.
There we go.
A part of me almost kind of wants to just rip the Band-Aid, Jake, and just start fresh. You can save, what is it? I mean, you can save close to $50 million if you just decide, you know what, cut, trade, release Bosa and Mack. And let's say they do the same for Mike Williams. That's like $75 million in cap space that they now have brought in. So they went from 50 over to 25 under with those three.
Right.
Maybe they restructured Derwin James. Maybe they restructured Justin. They would get rid of Eric Kendricks, maybe. Morgan Fox is a possibility, which we'll talk to in a bit. But sticking with the edge here, let's say you trade, release comp picks or trade picks. You go and replace those players with draft capital or free agents, which we'll talk about in a sec. Is the production going to be there? I don't know. You could argue, what production did Joey Bosa provide? And I think for what he provided, again, go look at the stats the last 2 years. You can probably get a defensive end or edge that could do the exact same production for literally a tenth of the price tag.
Ripping the Band-Aid off, Dan, makes a lot of sense. Honestly, it does. Let's just say you keep one or both if you were able to figure out some way to do that. At best, you're doing that for what, 1 year?
Mm-hmm.
You're just kicking the can down that far. This is not a situation where you expect them to be a staple for this unit for multiple years. This is a 1 year Band-Aid at best. You come back, you hope that you get that same type of production out of Khalil Mack. You hope that Joey Bosa is going to remain healthy. You pair that with what we saw from Tuli Tuipulotu last year, and you keep your fingers crossed. To me, this is going to be a situation where, again, I do not expect both of them to return. I expect at least one of them gone. I would not be surprised if we don't see both of them, just because now we're talking about a brand new regime, different head coach, different defensive coordinator. And I think the promise that you have with Tuli Tuipulotu that was shown, you need to find another young, athletic edge rusher like him to pair him with to move on through the future. You need to have a new bookend duo, in my mind. Now, not to say that Khalil Mack, another year of Khalil Mack and Tuli wouldn't be productive. I think it would. But I think you still have to invest in that. And whether that's a value free agent or you invest in it at some point in the draft, you have to do that. You can't just do this again and not prioritize it this year and then expect to get what you want next year after both of these guys are off that contract and then hope for the best with a rookie at that point. You can't do that. So I think one way or another, you're going to be pushing this forward with Tuli and question mark. You have to do it. As you mentioned, Chris Rumph just unfortunately has not put up the production that we believed he was going to be, even as a rotational edge rusher. And yes, Morgan Fox is kind of like the hybrid edge interior defensive lineman, and you could deploy him in a number of different ways. But if you can find a value signing like Morgan Fox, that would be a nice sub-plan. Now, is that necessarily going to be your starter across from Tuli? Not necessarily saying that. You have to put an edge group together that can not only be the type that are going to play your first two downs, but be these rotational pass rushing specialists. You have to start recreating this group, and you have to do it now.
So we'll get into kind of the performance of this group along with the interior defensive line here in a second. We'll kind of take a look at some PFF grades and how that shakes out. But again, you're not getting much from Joey Bosa. You're not getting much from Chris Rumph. You're not getting anything from anyone else because there's no one on the roster. Khalil Mack is long in the tooth, but he, again, balled out. Age, I think, is a concern for a lot of people, but the dude just had a career year. You could say, okay, well, maybe there's going to be a precipitous drop. Maybe. But his game seems to be aging well. There's nothing on tape that you saw last year that gave you red flags of, oh, there's a decline coming. Eventually it's coming. I don't think it's this year. I don't. So that's the edge position. And again, we're going to go through the position by position. We'll go through the free agents available, and then we'll go through possible draft scenarios here. The interior guys, Jake, I think is... what's a good way to put this? I don't want to say it leaves some to be desired, but there's a lot of names here that are unproven.
Yeah, it's like the incomplete grade. that you got, on test grades from time to time. You just don't know. There's a lot of question marks as it relates to this group. Tito, the first 2 years of his career have unfortunately not gone the way we would have hoped. Obviously, it took him a long time to come back off of that leg injury that he suffered 2 seasons ago. When he did come back, it wasn't as much as a contribution as you would have hoped that was going to be. Scott Matlock and Gerard Clark being both in their rookie season. Scott Matlock, seeing a handful of snaps, but not as much as you expected for him to see as a 6th-round pick. Gerard Clark obviously being an undrafted free agent. Didn't see much playing time outside of the preseason. Morgan Fox obviously once again showed his value. And as we said, he can be that kind of tweener, use him as an edge, use him at the interior of the defensive line. And then Christopher Hinton, he had just recently signed a futures contract where you bring him back. Hey, a familiar name, former Michigan alum. So I'm sure he's going to be welcomed to see some familiar coaches back in that room for that. But Dan, this is a lot different when you take Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson out of this conversation as far as how this interior defensive line looks. I remember back in November, you and I were having this conversation because I think the Chargers were picking, like, at that point in time, 9th or 10th. And we were talking about what this defensive line was looking like and kind of taking that forward look to it and saying, like, oh, it's going to be rough. At some point, the Chargers are going to have to invest in this. So just like the edge position, whether you're able to find a low-level value signing or go out and prioritize it in the draft, there are some guys that you can go out and look at as far as what you're going to need for Jesse Minter's defense. It's not the best interior defensive line class that a lot of people were expecting, but in terms of getting guys that can fit the mold of what it is that you want to do, yes, there are some guys that you could target in that circumstance.
And the names that we showed there, like Chris Hinton, Gerard Clark, those are practice squad guys. Like, these guys aren't on the actual roster. Like, the only 3 names on the roster for 2024 right now are Morgan Fox, Scott Matlock, and Tito. That's it. And with Morgan Fox, remember, he was brought in as like a deployed, like, specific scheme fit for Brandon Staley's defense. He was with them with the Rams, came with the Chargers. I think he has like a $4.75 million cap hit this year. They could save, I think, $3.5 million if they release Morgan Fox. I don't think Morgan Fox fits Jesse Minter's defense, if I'm being honest. I don't. So really, you're looking at Scott Matlock and Tito. And then Gerard Clark, Chris Hinton. Maybe they bring back a Nick Williams. I don't know. But, like, that's thin. That's very thin in a position that has to be thick, literally and figuratively.
Yes.
So we're looking at an edge group that may need at least 1, maybe 2 edge, maybe 3 if we're talking depth. Interior probably needs 2 minimum, probably 3 or 4. That's like 4 or 5 positions that have to get filled somehow. Free agent, or draft, or trade. And that's just the defensive line. That's scary. Jake, before we get any further, gotta pay the bills. Let's talk about our friends.
Let me tell you all about our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. It is the easiest way to get into all of the sports action. Underdog Fantasy and their pick'em game, just pick higher or lower on your favorite or list favorite players' stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Just pick between 2 and 5 players to fill out your pick'em entry. Get every pick right and take home some cold, hard cash. Just make sure to use the promo code UNLEASHED and get your first deposit doubled up to $500 by Underdog. Go over to Underdog Fantasy today and tell them that Chargers Unleashed sent you. Dan, one thing I wanted to touch on that when you were talking about just in general, the investment that essentially that you could possibly have to put on the interior defensive line and the edge. Doesn't this make a whole lot more sense if the Chargers move out of that 5 spot just to kick it off and start trading down? And like you even said, hey, what about a scenario of the Chargers trading down twice?
Man,
this is how many holes the Chargers have to fill. Now, again, we have not hit free agency yet. And we'll have a much better idea of what this team is going to look like when that day rolls around. But just
we'll talk about the free agents here in a second. There's guys there, but dude,
it's ridiculous. And again, the irony that the football gods want to continue to show upon me in a year where Dan and I both have two of our favorite prospects at the top of this draft, and the Chargers have the highest draft capital that they have had in terms of overall picks since they selected Joey Bosa. And now here comes the year that it would actually probably make the most sense for them to trade down.
Yeah, it's insane. And so let's talk about kind of how well these guys played. We're getting to the free agents available that they could possibly pay for to bring in their services or the draft. But let's talk about kind of how these guys actually did last year. Because sometimes, like, you think of the name, right? And you don't really recognize how well they performed. And again, like, PFF isn't the Bible, right? But it's like it's a good North Star for kind of seeing how these guys did. Last year, I would say, like, the team defense, run defense actually wasn't bad last year. Like, that wasn't their Achilles heel, although at times, of course, it reared its ugly head.
Better than 2022.
That couldn't be worse, that's for sure. Aside from Khalil Mack, there really wasn't much pressure sustained by this defense, like, production-wise. And so I wonder, like, we look at some of these guys, like Khalil Mack and Thule, right? We're looking at run defense. Those are the top names. 90.8 for Khalil Mack, Thule with the 88.4. Like, that's good. Look how far down you got to go before you get to Joey Bosa, who's at a 70 in run defense. 70. Thule had an 88. Joey Bosa had a 71 run defense. Pressure-wise, let's look at that. Khalil Mack, number one there too. Joey Bosa down there at 80. Is Joey Bosa worth that? I don't know. Look at tackling. Chris Rumph is there, I guess. He had a grand total of 100 plays. I don't necessarily know if you're really comfortable with that. Defensive grade overall. Khalil Mack standout, obviously. Joey Bosa, 13 points lower than him at a 78. You have to scroll down quite a bit. Thule's number 8 on the team, 71. Got to keep scrolling, keep scrolling, keep scrolling, keep scrolling, keep scrolling. Still going. SJD not on the team. Nick Williams at a 59. Chris Rumph, 58. Morgan Fox, 58. Chris Hitton, 56. Tito had a 50. Tito didn't play much. He was hurt a lot. How do you feel about that? How do you think Jim Harbaugh feels about that?
Not the best.
Not the best.
Not the best.
And Jake, you kind of warned me going into this episode. It's going to make you kind of rethink how much of a priority this should be in the draft or free agency. Because so much of the conversation, you and I, obviously, we're part of this. Oh, Malik Neighbors, wide receiver, at 5, gold. Brock Bowers, tight end, 5, gold. Trade back to 8, Roma Dunze, Terrion Arnold, Nate Wiggins, gold. You don't really hear many people talk about interior and the edge from the first round for the Chargers. It might not be what people want, and it might not be what they end up doing. But, Jake, you had said to me, it's probably a position or a group, edge and interior, that gets selected and taken care of with more capital than maybe folks are expecting. So brace yourself here.
Yes. 100%. And to the fact, I know that we're going to get to the draft prospects in a little bit, but I'll bring this up now considering your talk about where do you prioritize this, and it makes you think as far as with everything else that we have talked about as it relates to what the Chargers are going to do come April. Where are they going to prioritize this? Well, Dan, here's a fun fact for you. When Joe Ortiz was the Baltimore Ravens, you look at 10 of the last 11 years going all the way back to 2013. 10 of those 11 years, either an edge or interior defensive lineman was taken within the first 4 rounds. They made sure to prioritize the defensive line, whether it was interior or on the edge, 10 out of the last 11 years.
In the first 4 rounds.
In the first 4 rounds. Regardless of what the year was, whether it was in the first round, second round, third round, fourth round, they prioritized it 10 out of those last 11 years. So something to think about in terms of heading into this year. And again, we talk about as much holes that are on this roster and how many that you need to fill. God, trading down just is making so much sense day by day.
Yeah. And think about this, like introspectively for folks watching or listening, for folks who have done those mock drafts that go to rounds 4 and 5, listening to what Jake is saying about how Joe Ortiz has historically drafted, how many of your mock drafts have an edge or interior defensive lineman chosen in the first 4 rounds? I'll be honest, not a lot of mine. Because
sure, it shifted but around like December to then when we got to January, February, things were moving way over here.
Yep.
And I even remember where my brain was at in November.
Mm-hmm.
It was on the interior defensive line. And obviously that's shifted dramatically. But yeah, it's been a minute since I've really thought about where the Chargers are going to prioritize this. And when you break it down like this, yeah.
So
maybe it needs to be revisited.
Yeah, and I think like this, and this is kind of, as we get to the free agency here of this group, like so much talk is about the wide receiver group that needs to get improved. We don't know about Mike Williams or Keenan Allen, which it sounds like Keenan Allen's staying. You hear a lot about the running back position. You hear a lot about tight end, obviously, for good reason. You hear about the tackle position-ish. Center, clearly. Corner, clearly. Linebacker, clearly. Safety, probably. Like, that's the problem, is no matter what position the Chargers go through, if they stick and pick, they don't have enough selections. And so, let's say they don't do defensive line in the first 4 rounds. Like, that's not great. But let's say they do, and say they don't go corner. That's not great. Say they don't do tight end. That's not, like, no matter what you do, no matter how you slice it, there's only so many picks they have. And so that's kind of where I kind of get more into the rip the Band-Aid approach, where it gives you some relief to like go fix some of this stuff before entering the draft so you're not so desperate. And I know a lot of times, even the Chargers of this in the past, where they go through free agency, wave 1 and 2, then they go through the draft, figure out what they can get, then afterward they revisit free agency. Like, that's an option. And I do think restructuring some of these contracts for the team will help. But man, having $50 million versus $25 million cleared-ish helps a ton. Like, think about how many contracts you can bring in with $25 million of, again, not total, but like salary cap hit for 2024. Because again, there's roster bonus. It could be spread over. $25 million for a cap hit could be like 5, 6, 7, 8 players. And I'd argue in a Minter, Ortiz, Harbaugh style team building, that's more likely. So I don't know, man. Like, you gotta, it's gonna be tough. So let's get into it. So looking at this Chargers free agency options, and again, this is an eye chart, but I put here for folks looking on the left-hand side, all the defensive line for the interior free agents, at least a lot of them. On the right side, a whole bunch of edge positions that are free agents. And realistically, and again, because of the cap scenario they're in, Jake, you could probably chop the first half of both of these right off the board, because the Chargers aren't going to be able to afford a lot of this stuff. But before going into like specific names, how do you think the Chargers could or should look to possibly fill in some of the holes through free agency of this group?
I think either way, whether it's a situation where you keep Khalil Mack and you go into, one more year with him and Thule as your bookends, or even if you just cut ties completely and you open up a lot more cap space, I still think that the only flexibility that the Chargers have in this regard is you try to find a value edge 3, if you will. Mm-hmm. That would probably be the best case scenario. Again, we are not talking about 2 years ago when the Chargers had all the spending money in the world. We had this conversation on our live chat on Saturday this past week, and someone had suggested, it's like, oh, what if the Chargers can go out and sign Brandon Ayuk in free agency? And we said, you can't subplant a problem if you're going to get rid of Mike Williams and then go out and spend that big money again on a Brandon Ayuk or any other type of wide receiver. So in this circumstance, even if you move off of Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa, I don't believe you're going to then fill that void with spending more money again on the same position. It just doesn't make sense. So you'd have to be very wise in how you do this. So whether or not Khalil Mack stays, or if you cut ties completely and you go out and you draft an edge to bookend Thule, I still think your range for an edge 3 is a value free agent on the low end of this chart, regardless of whether it's interior defensive line or edge.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, like looking at some of these names, let's start with like the interior guys, like Chris Jones, no. Justin Matabuke, no. Christian Wilkins, would love it, but no. Leonard Williams, no. Like there's a bunch of names here that sound wonderful. I just don't see it happening. Like I think you're going to have to kind of look towards the bottom side of this. Again, we're looking for like value players. Like I think you can look at, I don't know, like a David Bada, which he's going to get re-signed. He's ERFA. Lawrence Guy, older veteran, probably not going to happen. Hassan Ridgeway, that's a possibility. Maybe do like a rental with Shelby Harris for a year. Don't know. Quentin Jefferson, possibly. Maybe. I don't know. For the edge position, kind of to your point, like there's names here. And I don't think I realized until we kind of went through this, like how many edge positions are going to be hitting free agency. Like the big names, you got Brian Burns, 25, like the guy's a stud. You're not affording that. Josh Allen, no way. Danielle Hunter, no way. Chase Young, like you could cross all these names off the board. But there are some names that I kind of am curious about what this team could do with them and how much they'd actually go for. Like I don't know what the value is going to be for like the underbelly of the free agents available for this Chargers team in free agency. Like Jatavian Clowney, I'm not sure what he's going to be going for. Leonard Floyd, up in there in age, 31 now, but maybe you could take a flyer on that. I don't know. Andrew Van Ginkel, I like him. I think he's good. A lot of people have talked about Josh Uche. Yeah, that's going to be tough to squeeze into the cap space they have. A name, though, that came up, Jake, that I am curious, and we both really liked him coming out. What would you think about like an AJ Epinesa signing? I don't know what the price tag would be. Let's say it like, I think I saw the value is projected to be like $5 million. Do you think they can squeeze that in?
Yeah, as an edge 3, that, I mean, God, just think about where your cap money has gone in that circumstance from Bosa and Mack. If hypothetically they're both gone,
it'd be edge 2 then. That'd be edge 2.
I mean, I still think that you would prioritize edge because you have to get younger. You have to start getting younger to pair with Thule moving forward. So
agreed.
I still even think that at that type of a price tag, that would be your edge 3 or edge 4, depending on how the Chargers would utilize Morgan Fox if they ultimately keep him on the roster. But yeah, I don't think that you're going to find your starting edge 2, because if that's the case, if you're going to go edge 2 and you're going to go with a veteran, then maybe it is the best case scenario in terms of production, familiarity, that you rework Khalil Mack's contract and that you kick that can down the road for one more year. And you have
so one of them. Keep one.
Right. Yeah. And you have Mack and Thule, who together were pretty nice compliments to one another throughout last season. You still prioritize edge in the draft. You get kind of the guy that you see a future in that you could bookend Thule with. Again, there's a lot of different avenues that the Chargers can go in this circumstance.
I think if it was up to me, and I know like it, unfortunately, it's a business, and there are going to be people leaving. It happens every year. There are going to be people leaving that you have to kind of take away the emotions of it. If it was up to me, if I had my choice of how to manage this, I think however they do it, trade, cut, really, whatever. I think Joey Bosa, in my opinion, odd man out. I think he's gone. Saved $23 million or so there. I think if you can restructure, add void years for Khalil Mack, you could probably save, I think, like $15 million in cap space just by restructuring it. Add another year or two. Give consistency for him and Thule. Bring in through draft or through free agency one of these guys. And hell, if you did like AJ Epinesa, you can do a longer term contract there. I mean, he's only 25. So that's an option. Like that could be your long term fit for Thule. Who knows? That's not bad. That's not bad. Like the drop off of production is so much better that way than if you were to rip the Band-Aid. But again, like that's where I'm maybe giving a bump to Harbaugh and Minter and Ben Herbert as a strength and conditioning guy to like get the most out of the talent they have and to bring up the talent level. Do they need like the star-studded defensive line? I don't know. That they haven't had it in the past. And look what they've done. Look at that Michigan defense the last 3 years. Top 5 in basically everything. And aside from Aiden Hutchinson, who are the edge players they've had on that squad that have gotten drafted? So
you've got a couple this year that are going to get drafted. That's edge. For sure. Yes.
Edge.
Yes.
But like, no, okay. They have guys getting drafted, but who's getting drafted?
Not first round talent.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly what I mean.
Yes, I got that. Guys. But yes.
So, Jake, smooth transition for you then. Now we get to talk about the fun stuff. All things focused now on the 2024 NFL Draft. Now, we'll start with the edge position here since we started there earlier, but a lot of names. And I remember Latu, like 2 months ago or so, he was like edge 1, 15 overall, hell, 10 overall. People were saying, dude, yes, him. Things have kind of simmered a bit there. But overall, there are some edge options. And again, like it could be day 1, it could be day 2, but history says it's rounds 1 through 4. Jake, what are your thoughts on edge class, types of edge, maybe some possible players to look for that would fit?
God, I know that we're not including names like Jared Verse and Dallas Turner, Chop Robinson into this conversation, but Latu is just...
I like him.
I love what I see from Latu. And of course, this would be, your trade down scenario. If you find yourself going back from 5, you go back to the teens, and depending on what the roster looks at that point in time, can you just imagine what this edge group would look like if you had Latu and Thule bookending this defense? Because both of their traits are so similar in terms of their motor, their constant go to the football. Latu, who just attacks with such power, great handwork.
And he's fast.
He's so fast. He's so fast. I think that Latu and Thule would complement each other so well in this particular circumstance. I just think that the fit and the mold would be exactly what you would want from a defense that attacks. Now, you go
real quick. You mentioned him and Thule together.
Yes.
Like Thule was brought in because of his production in college. 13 sacks for Latu this year. Like that's production.
It sounds very similar to the final year of Thule's.
That's what I'm saying.
At USC. Now, I know that he's kind of got the injury scares, and as we go through the combine and the testing, people want to get those cleared on medical standpoint. But just from what he brings to the table, I would not care if the first pick that the Chargers would take would be Latu, if it was a trade down scenario, and just to think about what that defense would look like if you paired those two together. That would be something that makes your mouth water for what that edge group is all of a sudden going to do. Now, you move a little bit further down the line, Dan. I mean, these are, again, this is not the entire class. We'll get into that a lot more as we get closer to to April. These are just some of the guys that I think would be great fits for this team. Jonah Ellis out of Utah, Dan. I love what I see from Jonah Ellis. And who knows where his draft stock is going to be come April, but 37 tackles, 12 sacks, 24 quarterback hurries, 1 forced fumble. He, kind of a lot like Latu, plays with that seek and destroy type of mentality. Quick first step off the line, gets to the backfield fast, comes off the edge with a spin move that would make Dwight Freeney just stand back and smile.
I like that.
Could power through shed blocks with ease to get to the quarterback. I really like what I see from Jonah Ellis. Now, obviously, you have to bring in some of the Michigan guys as well. So Jalen Harold, along with, Braden McGregor, they were the 2 bookend edge players for Michigan. And I think from what you see from Jalen Harold, I really likes, again, another guy who's got a spin move. But he comes off the edge with speed, sets the edge well against the run, diagnoses plays very well, has a lot of high football IQ when it comes to finding the football. I like what I see from him. We still have the line at 2 Michigan players that the Chargers could possibly take, and Jalen Harold could possibly be one of them. Last one on our slide, Dan, is Idisa Isaac out of Penn State, who Jim Harbaugh should be very familiar with, considering when Penn State played them, he had a great play versus Michigan on J.J. McCarthy when he shed a block and got after him. But in total, Dan, listen to this. Again, I know we talk about Chop Robinson a lot, but this was essentially the bookend. 37 tackles, 7.5 sacks, 1 forced fumble, 1 forced fumble, 1 fumble recovery. He's just a flat out disruptor. Another guy with a quick first step, great pass rushing abilities, sheds blockers quickly to get into the backfield to stop the run, shows a nice bend coming off. So he's got a multitude of different pass rushing skills that I really like. So again, this is just 4 guys that we're talking about in this circumstance, but I think that any one of those 4 would be a nice complement to this defense if we're talking about starting over, rebuilding your edge group, and moving forward with a guy to bookend Tuli Tuipulotu.
So, realistically, though, I think in the first round, and I don't think they do it at 5. So, I don't want to speak for you, but there's no way any of these guys, either these guys or any other guy that they have available.
This is not November. The Chargers are not picking 9th overall. And Jerzon Newton's draft stock is not that high. So things have changed over the last few months as it relates to the draft value. So no, sticking at 5 and taking an edge or an interior defensive line, absolutely not. This will either come on day 2, day 3, or more likely even with a trade back where the Chargers can add a little bit more draft capital in that scenario.
So realistically, unless it's after 10, I probably still or not. Maybe. There's no way the Chargers are drafting an edge position unless it's after 10 with a trade back, in my opinion.
Yes.
After that, you name it, they can do it. Now, this is where it kind of gets fun. Is you mentioned the Michigan players, right? There's a pretty good one over at Michigan on the interior defensive line. Chris Jenkins is an absolute stud. Now, is he a little undersized for the NFL?
Yes.
Maybe. Probably.
Yes.
But go look at what he was when he got to Michigan versus what he was after Ben Herbert and company got their hands on him for a while. And go look at how dominant he was for Michigan. He's been undersized for a while, and he's done just fine.
The size aspect. Oh, sorry, Dan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a couple other guys. Rook, and I've said this name probably for 2 months on this show, Jake. I still can't get the name right. Rook or Hororo.
It's almost like Scooby Doo a little bit. It's Ororo. That's basically how it is. That's how I've heard everybody else say it, and I know that if you watch the show long enough, I always try to make sure that I do not butcher names. But Ororo,
I butcher the shit out of them.
Ororo, yes.
I just want to see him drafted because I want to hear SoFi just shout his name after he makes a play. I just want to hear that on repeat. Just Ororo. T'Vondre Sweat though. Mountain.
My God.
Mountain. there's some guys like the interior defensive line. I know you said it's not as great as we've seen in the past, and that might be the case for like the first round guys, which again, I don't think they go first round interior anyway, so it doesn't really matter to the Chargers. Day 2, day 3, there's guys. There's a lot of guys. And again, you're looking at a Chargers defensive front that has a ton of versatility in how it's been deployed under Jesse Minter in Michigan for years. Like sometimes that defense was personified by its secondary success. Then some years it was the middle group. It was the linebackers. Some years, one year, it was all defensive line. So it's not like this Chargers defense is going to have to be stout in one position every single year. Jesse Minter is pretty flexible. And also, they can do it with a bunch of different archetypes. Interior defensive line, you said it. Rounds 1 through 4, one of these guys is going to get selected in the interior edge, most likely. What do you think they look for, like in a type, as well as maybe a few guys?
I mean, yeah, I wanted to touch on all of these because especially when you weigh that against what the interior defensive line already looks like, Tito, Matlock, Morgan Fox, Gerard Clark. If you look at Gerard Clark, it's like we were all talking about getting Jamal Williams vibes with how big he is and how much of a space eater he was. And, just unfortunately, we haven't seen enough of that yet to fully believe it. Now, you mentioned Chris Jenkins' smaller frame. Yeah, so he has 6'3", 305, but has a smaller frame than what would be considered ideal at that position. But he overcomes that in a variety of different ways, from his power, from his hand usage. The stats won't show it. I think he's a much better pass rusher than would show up on the stat sheet. He had a nice closeout to the season against those final 2 games against Alabama and Washington, 2+ performances there. Good lateral quickness when it comes to getting after the ball. Carrier. With Rukaroro.
Good job. Better than me.
If there was more consistency to his game, we would be talking about him so much more because he had a great start to the season. The first 3 games, you go back and you watch his production was phenomenal. Then through the middle part of the year, it's almost like he disappeared. And then once Clemson played Notre Dame, he finally started to get everything back. But he is arguably one of the more athletic interior defensive linemen in this class. He's expected to test extremely well. I'm really excited to see where his draft stock's going to go. Now we're talking about a space eater in T'Vondre Sweat out of Texas. 6'4", 362 pounds. Now, playing next to Byron Murphy is obviously going to be an advantage for what you're going to do from a production standpoint. Dan, still, even with that, 45 tackles, 2 sacks, 5 pass breakups, Dan. You heard me right. 5 pass breakups from a dude who is 362 pounds. If you go back and you actually watch how much air he is getting off the ball to go and bat down passes, which the Chargers never get, by the way.
Can we talk about that?
They never get batted down passes. But he is just an absolute space eater. He's a brick wall against the run. Deceptively explosive of a player of his size. I'll be interested to see when it comes around to the combine if he's still going to be at that 362 weight, because that's the biggest question mark for him. People said he's got first-round talent, which I totally get. But is this the guy that you're going to say can be a 3-down lineman for 4 quarters with his stamina at that weight? I'm not so sure about that. So
it reminds me of who was a player that was drafted by the Eagles?
Right, which he's probably not going to have.
Jordan Davis.
Yeah, he's probably not going to test with the same athletic abilities as Jordan Davis.
No, but I mean like the usage, and people were questioning how much he can actually stay on the field.
Sure, exactly. But if you want to just know about T'Vondre Sweat's power, look no further than what he did against the Senior Bowl against Arkansas offensive lineman Bo Leamer. I mean, talk about just getting manhandled. Sweat took him 5 yards backwards. Leamer didn't have a chance, and he was put down on the ground. So he can move bodies. Again, the biggest question mark with him is going to be his consistency. Can his motor last up those through 4 quarters? And is he going to be able to be that piece that you can build off of? Now, if we're talking just, again, what we compared for size-wise for what the Chargers have in that interior defensive room, T'Vondre Sweat would be a nice addition physically and literally to that defensive tackle room. Now, again, another guy that we have on here that I wanted to talk about is Brandon Fisk. I want to call him, Braden Fisk. I want to call him Braden Wilson Fisk, because he just plays angry like Wilson Fisk from Daredevil. Production was better for him in 2022 than it was in 2023. Still finished with 43 tackles, 19 hurries, and 6 sacks. He explodes off the line, Dan. Plays with that hair on fire mentality, can penetrate through an offensive line very, very quickly. He had a play against Louisville where literally it's just blink and you miss it with how quickly he gets into the backfield and stops the running back for negative yardage. That play alone is probably what highlights his best traits. His off the ball quickness, his handwork. He just had a great week of practice at the Senior Bowl. I'm excited to see what he's going to do at the Combine. His draft stock could definitely be on the rise.
Yeah. When you talk about T'Vondre Sweat though, dude, like that's my guy. I think that's like on the defensive front, that's the one where I'm like, I know there's question marks about how much he could be utilized. I don't care.
I think
how long has it been since we've had a guy like that on this team?
One of my favorite things that was ever said, and this was interesting. This goes back to a mock draft that was done by Trevor Sikkema. This was in November, very end of November, I think just after Thanksgiving, where the Chargers at that point in time were picking 9th overall, and he had the Chargers. This was his first 3 picks, by the way. He had them taking Jerzon Newton, 9th overall. He had them taking Quentin Mitchell in the 2nd round. That was back when Quentin Mitchell's draft stock was reasonable for the 2nd round. Yeah. Now, kiss that goodbye. And then he had the Chargers taking T'Vondre Sweat in the 3rd round. And he said the reason that he was doing that is he said, I like my Chargers defensive line like I like my Chipotle, double beef.
Yes. With 2 C's.
You don't even need 2 defensive linemen to get double beef. T'Vondre Sweat is double beef in it by himself. So that's how much space he eats. Yes.
Yeah, and again, like you talk about being able to bring in guys that can be deployed for like specific situations. And that guy's one of them, man. Like he is just a space eater. He's not going backwards. And he's a disruptor. And he's like one of those alpha type players and brings size that this defensive front just doesn't have. Like Gerard Clark, I guess you could say is that, but how much has he proven or played? Sounds nice. I will say, Tito Agbonia is a freaking man. That guy is so big and he is underratedly huge. I talked to him at Radio Row and I'm like, this guy makes me feel like I'm 4.
Oh, when we saw him walk past during the Rock Solid Sports memorabilia sign, I mean, we were sitting down, but even still, that was a big man that walked right past us.
Yeah, and they say he's listed at 6'3". There is no way. Like literally the top of my head, and I'm like 5'9", 5'10"-ish. The top of my head goes to his neck. His whole head is above me. So unless his head is 5 inches, which that's not the case, 6'3" is, or I'm 5'4". That's not the case. I know that. It's just not that.
Well, you're definitely not 6'2", Dan. So
no, I know. I'm not 6'2", 240, guys. Come on, let's be real here. So there's a lot of ways that they can slice this. And there's a lot of different, like big question marks about how this team can kind of move forward. I guess maybe the last question for you, Jake, is like when you're looking at this from a 50,000 foot view here. How would you kind of stack, or would you kind of organize how to fix this line? Like, is the first domino, I think, is going to be Mack or Bosa or both.
Right. Yes.
After that, what comes next? Is it then, like, I guess, do they trim everything inside first? They figure out if they want to keep Morgan Fox and save the $3.5 million. They figure out the Mack and Bosa stuff, and then they move to free agency. Like, will all that happen before we start free agency in a few weeks?
I would believe so. Yes. Because I think you have to make your decisions in that regard. I think if you're going to capitalize on Khalil Mack's trade value, you need to do that sooner rather than later. I think the closer that you get to the draft, and if you still have him on your roster at that point in time, I think the less likely that it is that you would get a, fair value return. Mm-hmm. So I think that all those moves are wrapped up well before the NFL draft. And I say that not just from that standpoint, but again, to help out your new coaching regime as well. If this was still Brandon Staley, Tom Telesco, you may be able to get away with a couple more weeks of that just because of the familiarity that you have. But now, if we're talking a new coaching regime, I think they would want to have their plan set exactly with what they want to do prior to that draft with as much time to prepare as possible. So yes, I think you figure all this out. And this is even true still for all the moves that need to be done on the offensive side of the ball on top of that, circa Keenan Allen, Mike Williams. But yeah, you figure all this out. And regardless what position we're talking about here, whether it's interior defensive line or edge, it's going to have to be a value body that you put into there. It really is. And, this will just be interesting to see because depending on how many holes that are going to be so-called filled by the time that we get to the draft, how many are going to actually be remaining for the Chargers to fill? And most likely, even with trade downs, you're still not going to be able to fill every single one.
No.
So this will be extremely interesting to see how Jim Harbaugh, the coaching staff, and especially Joe Ortiz want to prioritize this as we inch closer to April 25th. And obviously we have the combine that starts up next week, which is going to give us a whole nother point of view in terms of where the draft stock is going to go for a number of these different players. But yeah, prior to the league year, we'll start having a good idea of what the Chargers are really going to need come the draft.
And boy, are we going to be covering the combine. We got some fun, special things in store for Chargers fans for that. Jake, maybe the last question. And I know we haven't got to, we're going to, we do this every year. We'll have our top 10 fits for the Chargers specifically. Again, not just top 10 prospects, but top 10 fits for the Chargers by position. We'll get there. But right now, if you close your eyes, Chargers fans, and Jake, and you think about this Chargers team, the defensive line, and you fast forward the draft, regardless of what they do with Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa or Morgan Fox, an ideal scenario for you, Jake. Give me one free agent, if you go that route, and one draft prospect that not necessarily sure how or where or when, but those are the guys that you're like, man, if they could just get blank and blank on this team, Chargers country, let's ride.
I don't know if I could do that with free agency just because, again, it's so hard to tell right now. I can wholeheartedly say that whether Khalil Mack is remaining on this team or Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa are gone, you're probably not going to go out and get one of those big name defensive linemen, whether it's edge or interior defensive line. You're just not going to do that. So ideally, for me, again, I know we have talked about so many different draft scenarios on this show thus far, and we're not even out of February yet. And I would still, if you were to just say it in your head right now, would you prioritize corner over edge or interior defensive line? Yeah, probably I would. Would you prioritize wide receiver, tight end over interior defensive line and edge? I think with the players that you have the chance to get at 5, you may have to go BPA in that circumstance. Yeah. Center, obviously, that we have talked about, you are going to be prioritizing that at some point in this year because there literally is nobody there.
Yep.
If it was for me, Dan, I go back to the Latu conversation. If this was a trade back, and you got Latu to pair with Thule, that to me, you pick up extra draft capital, you select Latu in the teens and see what you do going forward. I think it's a great start. The best part about it is that the Chargers have so many different directions that they can go. I know that Dan and I specifically have pigeonholed ourselves into 2 specific players. And I know that a lot of Chargers fandom have done the same when it comes to the conversations of Malik Neighbors and Brock Bowers. And then there's a whole other contingent that believes that the Chargers should select an offensive tackle in Joe Alt.
They're wrong. They're wrong.
There is a plethora of ideas. I really do not care, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't care, because there's so many holes to fill. I don't care if they trade down and they take a corner, they trade down and take an edge, they trade back a few picks and they still take Brock Bowers. That would be a dreamer. In Dan's circumstance, you trade back to 8 and Malik Neighbors is still there on the board. I mean, my God, it doesn't matter. And this is only going to get worse or better, however you perceive it, as we move closer. Because to see how this team is going to prioritize their draft picks, and again, we say this because we have no idea what the hell Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh are going to do. If this was the old regime, we'd probably have a better idea for what they were going to prioritize first. But who knows? And honestly, that's the best part about going into April.
I got a scenario for you. All right, so Latu, honestly, it's hard to beat that. Ooh, that's hard to beat. If it was me, restructure Khalil Mack, trade Joey Bosa. You're probably going to release or cut Morgan Fox. If they can get AJ Epinesa, I think they can get him on a good 3-4 year deal for probably 4 years, 19-20 million ish in total. And then you add in Ben Herbert. And I'm just imagining Ben Herbert working with Trevondre Sweat, because you hear about all the before and after of what players have looked like. That would be
interesting to see. If there was anybody that was going to kick up Trevondre Sweat's stamina, you'd have to believe
that's what I'm saying. But imagine Ben Herbert's grin. Trevondre Sweat, a dude pushing close to 400 pounds. What he could do with that. And having that on the interior mixed with Mack, Epinesa, Thule, Tito, Matlock. We don't know what Gerard Clark is. But that's some serious beef. Tito, Matlock, Clark, and Trevondre Sweat. Good luck. And you get some conditioning going with those guys. Whew. And then you have honestly, Thule, Epinesa, and Mack, all versatile, can play both run and pass exceptionally well. That might be my ideal scenario. I love Latu, but I know what that means in terms of the other guys you're not getting.
Yes.
But you could say that going both ways. You could say that, if you went Roma Dunze at 10 or whatever they trade back.
Correct.
You could also say, there goes Latu. So this is going to be a position that I don't think enough people, including ourselves, didn't put as much of a priority on when it gets drafted or when it gets solved. But it's a big one. And it doesn't just get solved when you cut or trade Mack and Bosa. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Or hell, that's probably the base of the iceberg, if we're being honest. So that's it for edge, interior defensive line. It went a little long here, but I think that's by design. Jake, anything else we missed on this group? Any words of caution you want to give the Chargers fans as we continue on between now, combine, free agency, draft?
I mean, words of caution? Don't have to be words of... I would probably just say... And even I have to learn a lesson in doing this as well, because think about just the past few drafts that the Chargers have gone through. And when we get to that point of the player, the target, the priority, all that type of stuff, a lot of us had our guys in our head last year in terms of the wide receivers that we felt that the Chargers were going to go. They went a different direction. We've had that other years as well. Some years we've gotten that. Other years it hasn't been like that. But now for the Chargers having the highest draft position that they have had since they took Joey Bosa.
And Joe Ortiz at the helm, which look at the Ravens and how many times you've seen that draft class and say, how the hell did they get this guy to fall in their lap?
Exactly. So I would just say, don't entirely hitch your wagon to one person and just enjoy the ride, because I feel like the Chargers are going to go on one come April 25th.
We got to buckle up, strap in, because this roller coaster is going to be going fast and the ebbs and flows are going to go crazy. But we will be here for all of it. For Jake Hefner, you can find him at Jake T. Hefner, myself at Dan W. Sports. Again, we've done a bunch of positional value as well as positional breakdowns on a lot of these. I think the only one we have left, I believe, we're not going to do quarterback because, come on.
No, we got to get into all the. No, I'm just playing.
Are we trading? Are we trading for JJ McCarthy? No, obviously not. The only one we have left is the linebacker spot. So we'll get to that one. I believe we try to do it before the combine. So sometime in the next week. Until then, we'll talk to you guys next time. Chargers Unleashed.